A flurry of talk and clinking glasses filled the magnificent room as the business party got underway. As we laughed and joked, I recall being thrilled by the environment and relishing the attention while standing with my pals. For me, at least, it was one of those occasions when everything seemed ideal. I had been drinking, my inhibitions lowered, and the energy of the crowd was contagious. Brian, my husband, stood apart from the group, hovering at the edge of the room. He wasn't someone who thrived in social situations like this. He preferred quieter moments, more intimate gatherings, but I was too caught up in the moment to notice. Or perhaps I didn't want to notice. As we stood in our small circle, the conversation took a casual, playful turn. Someone made a snide comment about men who were whipped, controlled by their wives, and without thinking, I joined in. It wasn't just that I laughed. No, I laughed loudly, too loudly. Then, in a split second, I made a cruel joke mocking Brian, my own husband, in front of everyone. I can still hear the echo of my words hanging in the air, the way they seemed to fill the space, taking on a life of their own. At the time, I didn't even realize what I had done. My friends erupted into laughter, their amusement feeding my own sense of smugness, and I basked in the attention. It felt good in that moment to be the center of the fun, the one with the sharp wit. But as I look back, I can still picture Brian standing there, his face slightly turned away from the group, his expression distant and hurt. His shoulders slumped, but I didn't see it then. I didn't see the way the laughter had cut into him like a knife. Then came the moment that changed everything. I remember Brian walking toward me, and the air in the room seemed to shift. His steps were slow, deliberate, but there was something different in the way he moved, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As he approached, I tried to smile at him, expecting him to brush off the joke like he always did, but his face remained calm, unerringly calm. It wasn't until he got closer that I saw the storm in his eyes, a pain so deep that it made my stomach twist. He didn't make a scene. He didn't shout or confront me in front of everyone. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice so low that only I could hear it. "It's over," he whispered. And then he turned and walked away. Those two words hit me harder than anything I'd ever felt. It was as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. I stood frozen. My breath caught in my throat, the room around me suddenly distant and distorted. The laughter that had filled the space just moments before faded into a muffled roar. I wanted to run after him, to call out and take back everything I had said, but I couldn't move. The weight of what I had done paralyzed me. I stood there, surrounded by friends who were still caught up in their laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that my world had just collapsed. I had never thought that a few careless words, spoken in jest, could ruin everything. But there I was, at a business party that had suddenly turned into the worst night of my life. Brian was gone, and with him went everything we had built together. As the night continued around me, I was left alone with my thoughts, replaying the moment over and over again. I could see the exact instant I had lost him. The moment I let my need for attention and validation outweigh the love I had for my husband. How had I become this person? The kind of person who would mock the man she once cherished above all else. It wasn't always like this. I wasn't always like this. Hashtag part 2. How we met. Before that fateful night, there was a time when I was someone else entirely. I used to be the kind of person who would never have dreamt of hurting Brian. The kind of person who valued every moment with him. Our relationship had begun in such a simple, almost cliched way, yet it felt like the beginning of something profound. We met at a cafe on a rainy afternoon. I was rushing, running late as usual, juggling my coffee, my bag, and my phone. Of course, in my hurry, I managed to spill the coffee all over myself. I remember standing there embarrassed and flustered, trying to clean up the mess when Brian appeared. He wasn't dramatic or flashy about it. He simply handed me a napkin with a soft smile, offering to help. There was something so gentle about him, so calm, that it instantly put me at ease. I remember thinking how different he was from the kind of guys I usually went for. He wasn't loud or overly confident, but there was a quiet strength to him. That was the start. Our first date was nothing extravagant. We went for a walk in the park, talking for hours. There was no grand gesture, no fireworks, but it was perfect in its simplicity. He listened. Really listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone saw me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. As we spent more time together, I began to fall for him, hard. We shared everything, Our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future. Brian had this quiet ambition about him. He wasn't in a rush to conquer the world, but he had dreams of starting his own business. Something small that would give him the freedom to live on his own terms. I admired him for that, for his patience and his steady determination. He was so different from me in that way. I was always rushing, always chasing the next thing, while Brian was content to take his time, to build something meaningful from the ground up. I still remember the moment I knew I loved him. It wasn't during some grand romantic event. It was on a rainy day, not unlike the one we first met. We had planned to go out, but the weather kept us in. So we ordered takeout and spent the day watching old movies on the couch. At one point, I looked over at him, sitting there with his goofy smile, completely at ease, and I realized that this was happiness. Not the rush of excitement or the thrill of new love, but the quiet, steady contentment of being with someone who made you feel safe and understood. We got married a year later. It wasn't a big wedding, just close friends and family, but it was perfect. I still remember looking into his eyes as we said our vows, promising to love and support each other through everything life would throw at us. In that moment, I meant every word. I believed in us. In the future, we would build together. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was both of us. But as time went on, life became more complicated. Brian's business struggled to take off, and we began to feel the strain. Meanwhile, I was climbing the corporate ladder, working longer hours, attending more and more events. I became obsessed with the success, the validation, the rush of being important. And in the process, I lost sight of Brian. He remained the same, kind, patient, always supportive. But I wasn't the person he had married anymore. I became sharper, more critical, always pushing for more money, more success, more recognition. And now I've lost the one thing that mattered most. In my relentless pursuit of success, I began to view Brian as less ambitious, less driven, less of a man. It's painful to admit that now, because it makes me feel monstrous, but it's the truth. I found myself looking down on him, resenting his calm, steady demeanor, which was once something I deeply admired. It was that very steadiness that had drawn me to him in the first place. But as I became more focused on achieving more, on climbing higher, I wanted him to change, to be more like me. I wanted him to be ruthless, aggressive, and willing to chase after success at any cost. But that was never who Brian was. And instead of accepting him as he was, I began to criticize him subtly at first. It started with small remarks, innocent on the surface, little suggestions that he wasn't doing enough or that he needed to step up. But over time, those comments sharpened. The sarcasm grew more biting, and eventually I found myself mocking him outright, even in front of others. I don't know exactly when things escalated to that point, but looking back, I wonder if it was some sort of defense mechanism. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself, to my friends, or to the world. I wanted to be seen as powerful, successful, and strong. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that belittling Brian made me look that way, but it didn't. It just made me cruel. Now all I have are memories of the person I used to be, the woman who loved Brian for who he truly was, not for who I wanted him to become. That woman is gone, replaced by someone I hardly recognize. Someone who can't take back the words that destroyed everything we had. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted, when my admiration for Brian turned into resentment. I've played it over and over in my mind, trying to figure out how I went from cherishing him to tearing him down. It was a slow descent, almost imperceptible at first. I didn't wake up one day and decide to bully my husband. It crept in like poison, seeping into the cracks of our relationship. It started with my own insecurities. Though I didn't realize it at the time, my career was soaring, and I was becoming the person I had always dreamed of being, successful, confident, respected. I was earning more than Brian, climbing the ladder faster than I ever imagined. People noticed me. They admired me. They envied me. And I thrived on that attention, that validation. With each step I took towards more success, I started noticing something else. Brian stayed the same. He was content with his small business, happy to grow it at his own pace. He didn't care about impressing anyone or about the superficial measures of success that consumed me. At first, I told myself I admired his patience, his quiet determination. But as time went on, that admiration soured. I began to question why he wasn't more like me. Why wasn't he pushing harder? Why wasn't he as hungry for success? That's when the comparisons began. At the business events I attended, I was surrounded by powerful men, CEOs, executives, leaders who were ambitious, ruthless, and driven. They talked about million-dollar deals, expansion, growth. They were magnetic, and I began to wonder why Brian wasn't like them. Why wasn't he the man everyone envied? It wasn't fair to him. I see that now, but at the time, I couldn't help feeling like his lack of ambition was a reflection of my own inadequacies. The first time I made a snide remark, it was almost accidental. We were at a dinner party with friends and someone asked about Brian's business. I jumped in before he could respond, making a joke about how he loved taking his time. Everyone laughed, including Brian, though I noticed a slight falter in his smile. It was a small jab, but it gave me a sense of power. By putting him down, I lifted myself up, and I didn't realize it then, but it became a pattern. I started making offhand comments in front of friends, little digs about how relaxed Brian was with his business, how he wasn't in any rush to grow it. It was always cloaked as humor, something lighthearted, but deep down, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was chipping away at him piece by piece, and every time I did, I felt that same rush of superiority. Brian wasn't the type of man to fight back. He wouldn't call me out in front of others. He'd laugh it off, make a self-deprecating joke, and the conversation would move on. But behind closed doors, I could see the change in him. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't laugh as easily, didn't meet my eyes as often. I told myself he was just stressed, busy with work, but I knew the truth. I was pushing him away, and he was letting me. The worst part is, even when I saw the hurt in his eyes, even when I noticed him pulling away, I didn't stop. Instead, I doubled down because the truth is, it wasn't just about Brian. It was about me. I was scared. Scared that I wasn't enough, that my success wasn't enough. No matter how high I climbed, it couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. So I took it out on him. Brian became the target of all my frustrations, my insecurities, my fears. If I could make him look smaller, maybe I would feel bigger. If I could point out his flaws, maybe no one would notice mine. It was twisted logic, but at the time it made sense. It made me feel better, at least temporarily. And so I became more ruthless with my words, openly criticizing him not just in private, but in front of others. There were countless moments when I questioned his decisions. Privately, I would confront him, telling him he wasn't doing enough, that he needed to step up and be a man. I'd criticize his work ethic, implying he was lazy. Indifferent to our future, the first time I said those words, I'll never forget his expression. He just stared at me, his face full of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what I was saying. For a second, I almost retracted my words, almost apologized. But instead, I hardened my resolve. I convinced myself that he needed to hear it, that I was helping him by forcing him to confront his shortcomings. I rationalized it as tough love, believing I was pushing him to be better. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I could see it every time he withdrew a little more, every time the light in his eyes dimmed just a fraction more. I knew I was hurting him, but I kept going because somehow it made me feel powerful. I convinced myself I was in control, but in reality, I was far from it. I was spiraling, and I was dragging Brian down with me. Looking back, it's clear how toxic I had become. I let my own insecurities and fears shape me into someone I barely recognized. I became someone who needed to tear others down to feel better about myself. Someone who couldn't appreciate the quiet, steady love that Brian had always given me. And the worst part? I didn't even realize how much damage I had done until it was too late. By the time I understood the weight of my words, by the time I saw how far I had pushed him away, it was already too late. I had lost him, and it was entirely my fault. I had always thought Brian was unbreakable, that no matter what I said or how many cutting remarks I made, he would stay the same, calm, composed, and forgiving. But everyone has their limits, and I didn't see his until I had crossed it. Bit by bit, I chipped away at him, not realizing that eventually there would be nothing left. I pushed him to his breaking point, and when he finally broke, it shattered both of us. It wasn't some dramatic event, no party or screaming fight. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, just another day, the two of us sitting across from each other at the dinner table. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, something we had grown accustomed to over the months, or maybe even years, of barely speaking to one another. I don't even remember what we were eating. What I do remember is coming home, exhausted and irritated after a long day at work where people made me feel important, admired. Brian had cooked dinner, like he often did, and instead of thanking him, I made some careless comment about how he must have too much time on his hands. He didn't respond, he never did anymore. He just stared down at his plate, pushing food around with his fork. The silence was unbearable, so I did what I always did. I made another sarcastic remark. Something about how maybe if he spent less time cooking and more time focusing on his business, things would be different. The words themselves are a blur, but I remember the tone, sharp and biting, delivered as if it were a joke when we both knew it wasn't. But this time he didn't laugh it off. He didn't try to make a self-deprecating joke or change the subject. Instead, he quietly set down his fork and looked up at me. The look in his eyes, it wasn't anger. I had expected anger, expected him to snap, to yell, to finally tell me to stop. What I saw was something far worse, resignation. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. At first I didn't understand. Those were words you hear in movies or heated arguments, but never spoken in such a calm, deliberate way. There was a finality in his tone that chilled me. "What do you mean?" I asked, sharper than I intended. "You can't do what anymore?" He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in what felt like years. In his eyes, I saw everything: the exhaustion, the hurt, the years of holding on to something that had long been slipping away. "This," he said, gesturing between us, "us. I can't keep pretending everything's okay. It's not. It hasn't been for a long time." A flicker of panic rose inside me, but I tamped it down. I told myself this was just another one of our fights, that he'd calm down and things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just another argument. "Don't be dramatic, Brian," I said, trying to brush it off, trying to regain control. "We're just going through a rough patch." "Everyone does." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't a rough patch, Claire. This is something else. Something I don't know how to fix." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, to say anything that might make it stop, but he cut me off. "You've been pushing me away for years, and I've let you. I kept thinking things would get better, that you'd come back to me, that we'd find a way to make it work. But every time I tried, you shut me down. You made me feel small, and I don't think I can take it anymore." I was stunned. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. I always thought that if things ever got really bad, we'd fight, yell, scream, and then fix it. But there was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion, defeat. "You don't mean that," I said, my voice faltering. "We can fix this. We just need time." "Time," he interrupted, shaking his head. "We've had time, years of it, and look where we are." Panic surged through me, but I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to take back all the hurtful things I'd said over the years. "Brian, I'm sorry," I blurted out. The words felt foreign, unfamiliar. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just frustrated, but we can work through this. Can't we?" He looked at me for a long time, and for a moment I thought he might say yes. But then he shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "I don't think I have anything left to give." The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't know what to say. All the power I thought I had in our relationship, all the control I had fought so hard to maintain, slipped away in that moment. "I love you, Claire," he said softly. But love isn't enough anymore, not when it's so one-sided. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg him to stay, but the words wouldn't come. I had spent so long pretending I didn't need him that I was stronger without him. And now, when I needed him most, I didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step was final. "I'll stay at my brother's for a while," he said, not looking at me. "I think we both need some space." And with that, he walked away. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, leaving me alone in the silence of our home. A home that suddenly felt too big. I sat there staring at the empty chair where he had been, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. I had pushed him too far for too long, and now he was gone. And the worst part was I couldn't blame him. Not really. I had done this. I had driven him away with my cruelty, my need to control, my fear of vulnerability. I had thought I was strong, independent. But now, sitting alone in that empty house, I realized just how fragile I really was. Brian had been the best part of me, and now I had lost him forever.